There is this really peculiar tension when you hold a historical document that is just undeniably brilliant.
Right.
I mean, it's heavily circulated, structurally flawless, and yet completely anonymous.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating, actually.
It is. You read it, and the voice on the page is just so authoritative. It's so deeply entrenched in the political and religious life of its era.
You feel like you should instantly recognize who is speaking.
Exactly. But the metadata just isn't there. There's no sender, no specific address, no date.
Nothing.
Just a voice speaking out of the first century into, well, an absolute void.
And it forces us to read the text in a completely different way.
How so?
Well, when you don't have the luxury of a biographical profile to lean on, you have to reconstruct the author and, more importantly, the crisis they are responding to.
Right.
You have to do it entirely from the internal architecture of the document itself. It becomes this forensic exercise.
So, welcome to this deep dive into the source material. Today we are unpacking a really comprehensive document titled Survey of Hebrews by Chris R. Velasquez.
It's a fascinating survey.
It really is.
Yeah.
And our mission today is to decode the intensely complex background of the letter to the Hebrews. We're looking at a first-century sermon addressed to a community that is, well, on the brink of total social and psychological collapse.
Yeah, they're barely hanging on.
So we want to understand the architectural brilliance of the author's argument, why their warnings are so severe, and what this masterclass in human resilience means for you, the listener, today.
There's a lot to cover.
There is. So, okay, let's unpack this. We have a masterpiece of quaint Greek, steeped in the Septuagint, sitting right in the middle of the New Testament.
Right.
And the traditional historical assumption has always been that Paul wrote it, right?
Huh.
But the Velasquez survey, and honestly broader modern scholarship, they just seem to reject that outright.
They do, yeah. And for very good reason, actually. The association with the Apostle Paul is, well, it's an ancient one.
That's ancient, are we talking?
We see it in early manuscript traditions, like Papyrus 46, which dates back to roughly 200 CE. It actually bundles Hebrews right in with the Pauline epistles.
Oh, wow. So they just assumed it was his from very early on.
Yeah, because for a long time, canonical acceptance was deeply tied to apostolic authority.
Right, you needed a big name attached to it.
Exactly. So slapping Paul's name on it helps solidify its place. But when you actually read the Greek text, the stylistic and theological dissonance from Paul is just glaring.
I mean, the vocabulary alone feels like it belongs to a completely different school of thought.
It really does.
Like, Paul's letters are rugged,
Yeah.
They're passionate. Sometimes he even breaks grammatical rules because he is just dictating on the fly.
He's wrestling with his thoughts in real time.
Right. But Hebrews is polished. It is perfectly symmetrical.
It reads like a highly refined classical oration. I mean, the author of Hebrews uses about 150 words that appear literally nowhere else in the New Testament.
Really? 150 unique words.
Yeah. The Greek is incredibly sophisticated. And furthermore, Paul usually identifies himself in the very first sentence, right?
Right. He always establishes his apostolic credentials immediately.
Exactly. The author of Hebrews never does that. In fact, in chapter 2, the author explicitly includes themselves among those who received the gospel secondhand.
From those who heard the Lord directly.
Yes. And Paul fiercely defended the fact that he received his gospel directly from Christ, not secondhand.
Okay, so if the Pauline attribution is totally off the table, we are looking at a very specific profile for our mystery author.
Very narrow profile, yeah.
They have to be someone deeply educated in Hellenistic rhetoric, intimately familiar with the intricacies of Israel's cultic system, and highly respected by the early Jewish Christian community.
And the list of proposals we have is just a fascinating reflection of the early church's intellectual depth.
Like who? Who are the main suspects?
Well, you have scholars arguing for Luke, given the highly polished Greek.
That makes sense.
You have arguments for Barnabas, who was a Levite from Cyprus. That would explain the deep obsession with the Levitical priesthood and the Hellenistic background.
Okay, yeah.
But one of the most compelling suspects, and one that fits the rhetorical profile perfectly, is Apollos.
Ah, because of his background in Alexandria.
Yes, exactly. The book of Acts describes Apollos as an eloquent man, a native of Alexandria who was mighty in the scriptures.
And Alexandria was like the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic Jewish world, right?
It was. It was the home of Philo, who pioneered the kind of allegorical and typological interpretation of the Old Testament that we see woven throughout Hebrews.
So Apollos had the exact intellectual pedigree to write a text that seamlessly merges Greek rhetorical structure with this deep cultic Jewish theology.
He absolutely did. But, the survey also mentions Priscilla as a serious proposal.
Right, which introduces a totally different dynamic to the anonymity.
It really does. The Priscilla theory, which was famously championed by the historian Adolf von Harnack, is speculative, but it's highly intriguing.
She was a pretty prominent teacher in the early church, wasn't she?
She was. She and her husband Aquila actually instructed Apollos in Ephesus.
Oh, that's a fascinating connection.
Right. And if a woman had authored this sweeping, authoritative theological treatise in the intensely patriarchal environment of the first-century Roman world.
The text might have faced immediate rejection based solely on her gender.
Exactly. So removing her name or allowing it to circulate anonymously would ensure the community engaged with the theology rather than the sociology of its authorship.
That is such an interesting theory. But I guess Origen's conclusion back in the 3rd century is still where we land.
Which was?
Only God knows the truth.
Yeah, that seems to be the only definitive answer we have.
But the anonymity doesn't obscure the function of the text. I mean, the author self-identifies in chapter 13, not as a letter writer, but as someone delivering a word of exhortation.
Which is the technical idiom for a synagogue sermon.
So this isn't just a casual piece of correspondence.
No, not at all. It is a highly structured, meticulously planned homily. And a sermon implies an audience sitting in the room listening.
And to understand why this sermon is so incredibly dense, we have to reconstruct the flesh and blood reality of the people it was preached to.
We have to know who was sitting in those chairs.
Right. So the survey places this audience in the late 1st century Roman imperial world. They are Jewish Christians.
Or at the very least, a community whose entire worldview is structured by Israel's scriptures.
And the defining characteristic of this community at the moment the sermon is delivered is profound, exhausting crisis. They are on the verge of fracturing.
The crisis is the engine driving the entire document. The author isn't writing a systematic theology textbook for a library,
Right. It's not just an academic exercise.
They are writing a survival manual for a community under fire. And the specific nature of their suffering is deeply tied to the socio-economic realities of antiquity.
The Velasquez survey points out that they lived in an honor-shame culture, which is hard for us to grasp today.
It is. In the modern West, we tend to view honor and shame as internal psychological states.
Like you feel guilty or you feel proud.
Exactly. But in the 1st century Mediterranean world, honor and shame were external, economic, and legal realities.
It dictated your access to resources.
Yes.
Like if you lost your honor, you lost your credit score, your legal protection, your standing in the trade guild.
You lost your access to the patronage network. It was a form of social death that inevitably led to physical deprivation.
That is brutal.
Hebrews 10:34 gives us a stark historical window into what they had already endured.
What does it say?
Well, the author reminds them of a time when they were publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and explicitly mentions the confiscation of their property.
Oh, wow. So they had their homes, their businesses, or their wealth legally stripped from them.
Or destroyed by mobs, simply because of their association with this new marginalized sect surrounding Jesus.
And I think the really insidious part of this crisis is the specific temptation it breeds.
The temptation to just give up.
Yeah. When we think of apostasy, the cultural imagination usually goes to someone dramatically shaking their fist at the heavens.
Right. Reading some skeptical philosophy and declaring they no longer believe in the supernatural.
Exactly. But the temptation this audience faces isn't intellectual skepticism, it's fatigue. They are just bone tired of being on the outside.
They are experiencing extreme social friction. Every single day, their allegiance to Christ costs them something tangible.
And the temptation is regression. They're tempted to drift back to Second Temple Judaism.
And we really have to view that option through their eyes to understand its gravitational pull.
Because Judaism wasn't some dark, empty alternative to them.
Not at all. It was ancient. It was majestic. It had the weight of centuries of prophetic history.
And more importantly, from a Roman legal perspective, Judaism was a religio licita.
Right. Yes, a legal, recognized religion. The Romans respected antiquity. If your religion was old, even if they thought it was weird, they generally tolerated it.
But Christianity was new and therefore dangerous.
Precisely. As long as the early Christians were viewed by Rome as just another sect within Judaism, they enjoyed that legal umbrella.
But as the church grew, Those theological lines became clearer.
And Christianity began to be recognized as a distinct entity, an illegal one.
So for this exhausted community, returning to the synagogue wasn't necessarily a total abandonment of God in their minds.
No, it was a retreat to safety. It was stepping back under the legal protection of the Roman Empire and the social embrace of their broader Jewish community.
You know, it almost feels like the dynamic of a modern startup that is just running out of capital.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Think about it. The founders are facing immense public scrutiny. Their funds are being seized, the market is turning against them, and they are sleeping maybe 3 hours a night.
They're completely burned out.
Right. And the Old Covenant, Second Temple Judaism is like the massive, well-established corporate firm they used to work for.
It has an HR department, it has legal protection, it has a guaranteed pension.
Yes. The temptation to just quietly abandon the volatile startup, update the resume, and go back to the safe corporate gig is overwhelming.
That is a highly accurate parallel for the psychological state of this audience. The corporate gig represents stability.
And the author of Hebrews recognizes that you cannot fight that kind of deep systemic fatigue with a lighthearted pep talk.
You definitely can't. You don't tell a community facing the confiscation of their property to just hang in there.
You have to give them a vision of reality so massive, so unshakable, that the Roman Empire and the loss of their social capital suddenly look trivial by comparison.
Which explains the incredible architecture of the sermon. The author meets this intense vulnerability with immense theological density.
The survey points out how carefully the text uses structural markers, words like therefore or since we have.
Right. It's an alternating rhythm between cosmic exposition and urgent exhortation.
So the author builds this towering theological edifice and then immediately pivots to apply it directly to the audience's endurance.
And the Greek structure mirrors the pastoral intent perfectly. I mean, the opening sentence of Hebrews is widely considered one of the most magnificent pieces of Greek prose in the entire New Testament.
It sets up the central thesis of the whole book, using a profound contrast.
It does. The survey highlights the opening words. Polymeris kai polytropis.
In many portions, in many ways.
Yes, it sets up a contrast between how God used to speak and how God has definitively spoken now.
So the author says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets.
And that Polymeris kai polytropis describes a real but fragmented revelation.
It was piecemeal.
Exactly. A dream here, a burning bush there, a prophetic oracle, a temple ritual. It was distributed across centuries.
But then the sentence pivots with this massive contrast.
Yeah.
But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son.
The transition from the fragmented shadows to the singular coherent reality.
And the way the author describes the Son in that prologue is just staggering. They use these incredibly rich Greek terms.
Right. The Son is described as the apolgasma of God's glory and the character of his nature.
Those two words are doing immense heavy lifting. Let's break those down.
Well, apolgasma can mean either a reflection or a radiance.
But in the context of Hebrews,
It clearly leans toward radiance. The sun isn't a moon reflecting the light of the sun. He is the outshining rays of the sun itself.
you cannot separate the sun from its rays.
Exactly. And character is an even more tactile word. In antiquity, it referred to the tool used for engraving, or the exact impression left by a die on a coin or a seal in wax.
So the Son is the exact ontological imprint of the Father's essence.
Right. If you have seen the impression, you know exactly what the die looks like.
But, setting up this contrast between the prophets and the Son poses a real pastoral risk, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if this audience deeply reveres the prophets and their entire heritage is built on that fragmented revelation, telling them that it's obsolete seems like a fast track to alienating them.
It is a risk, yeah.
So how does the author manage the risk of offending the very people they are trying to comfort?
By validating the past while insisting on its finality in the present. The author never claims the prophets were wrong or that the Old Covenant was a mistake.
They argue from a framework of redemptive historical development.
Yes, the preparatory stages were flawless in their design, but they were designed to end.
Oh, I see.
If you are reading a brilliant mystery novel, the early chapters are essential. They set the clues. But once you reach the final chapter, the climax where the detective reveals the truth.
You don't close the book, ignore the ending, and go back to reread chapter 3.
Exactly. Jesus is the eschatological climax. He is the definitive last days speech of God. To retreat to the prophets is to abandon the fulfillment for the preparation.
This speaks so directly to the listener today, navigating our own cultural moment.
It really does.
We don't live under the Roman Empire, but we absolutely live in a polymerous chi polytropes world.
A world of many portions in many ways.
Yes, we are drowning in a culture of intense fragmentation. We pull a philosophical soundbite from a video, a moral framework from a political party, a spiritual practice from an app, and we try to stitch it all together into a coherent life.
And that fragmentation is exhausting. It leads to its own kind of socio-spiritual fatigue.
So the profound relief that the author of Hebrews is offering this first-century community
And by extension, you, the modern reader.
is the discovery of a coherent center. If Jesus is the character of God, the exact imprint of reality, then he is the organizing principle of the universe.
You don't have to desperately stitch together fragments anymore. You anchor to the center, and the center holds.
But wait, if Jesus is the ultimate final reality, that creates a massive logistical problem for these readers.
The physical religion?
Exactly. What on earth are they supposed to do with the physical religion they've relied on their whole lives?
Right.
The author can't just say Jesus is better and ignore the elephant in the room, the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices.
The audience's entire physical, sensory experience of God is tied up in what the survey calls the cultic matrix.
And deconstructing that cultic matrix is the central argumentative burden of Hebrews, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's one thing to say the prophets were preparatory. It's another thing entirely to look at the Levitical priesthood and declare it fundamentally insufficient.
Because that was an institution ordained by God through Moses, maintained for centuries, central to Jewish identity.
Right. So the author handles this by charting the movement from promise to shadow to substance.
They trace the redemptive historical timeline through the Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Davidic covenants,
showing how all of them are structurally designed to funnel into the new covenant promised by the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 31.
And the author quotes Jeremiah at length to prove that the Old Testament itself predicted its own obsolescence.
In fact, the quotation of Jeremiah 31 in Hebrews 8 is the longest Old Testament quotation in the New Testament.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the author uses their own scriptures to prove that God always intended to replace the external law written on stone with an internal reality.
But to execute this argument regarding the priesthood specifically, the author has to overcome a glaring legal hurdle.
The tribal lineage.
Right. According to the Mosaic law, priests only come from the tribe of Levi. But Jesus is from the tribe of Judah.
Yes.
So if Jesus is the ultimate high priest, how does he bypass the Levitical requirement legally?
This leads us to one of the most fascinating esoteric deep dives in the entire document, the Melchizedek typology in chapter 7.
I love this part. The author pulls this incredibly obscure figure out of the ancient past to solve the legal problem.
It is a masterclass in first-century Jewish exegesis. The author goes all the way back to Genesis 14.
Set the scene for us.
So, Abraham has just defeated a coalition of kings and is returning with the spoils. He is met by a mysterious figure named Melchizedek, the king of Salem and priest of God Most High.
Melchizedek brings out bread and wine, blesses Abraham, and then Abraham gives him a tenth of the spoils.
Right. And the author seizes on that interaction and extracts a massive theological point from it.
The father of the Levitical system, Abraham, is submitting to and tithing to a different, older royal priesthood.
Exactly. The author argues that because Levi was still in the loins of his great-grandfather Abraham, the Levitical priesthood technically paid tithes to the Melchizedekian priesthood.
Wait, that is such a clever argument.
It is. And the principle is that the lesser is always blessed by the greater.
Therefore, there is a legitimate, God-ordained priesthood that predates Levi, operates outside the Mosaic law, and is inherently superior to it.
And the author connects this historical narrative from Genesis to the poetic theology of Psalm 110, where God swears an oath to the Davidic king.
You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
The survey notes that this wasn't just a fringe interpretation invented by the author of Hebrews either.
No.
We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the manuscript known as 11Q13, that the Jewish sect at Qumran also viewed Melchizedek as a highly exalted heavenly figure.
Someone who would play a crucial role in the eschatological jubilee, freeing people from the debt of sin.
So the author of Hebrews is tapping into a vibrant cultural matrix to prove that Christ, who holds an indestructible life, belongs to this eternal royal priesthood.
So if Christ is the true high priest, ministering in the true heavenly sanctuary, the earthly sanctuary in Jerusalem is just demoted.
It isn't false, but it's just a copy, a shadow.
The author argues in chapters 8 and 10 that the earthly rituals, the blood of bulls and goats, the repeated entry into the holy place, could never achieve what the Greek calls telechis.
Right, religious perfection or consummation.
The earthly sacrifices were an anticipatory loop.
They were a vivid, bloody, sensory reminder of sin, but they couldn't actually clear the human conscience. The blood of a goat cannot enact moral transformation in a human being.
It was a shadow cast backward into history by the reality of Christ's future sacrifice.
Yeah.
It also sounds like they're looking at a blueprint. Like, the schematic is real. It was drafted by the master architect.
You can trace the lines.
Yeah, you can see where the walls are supposed to go, where the sanctuary is located. And it is essential for constructing the building.
But once the physical house is built, you can't live inside a piece of paper.
Exactly. The author is looking at this persecuted community standing out in the cold, tempted to go back to the blueprint because they remember how safe it felt to hold it in their hands.
That analogy captures the pastoral urgency perfectly. The author is begging them not to trade the warm, solid, finished reality of Christ's once-for-all sacrifice for a paper schematic.
A schematic that can never actually shelter them from the ultimate judgment.
Which asks a deeply penetrating question of you, the listener, right now.
What are the blueprints in your own life? What are the systems, the daily routines, the old institutional loyalties that you cling to because they offer the illusion of safety?
We often prefer the predictable shadow over the demanding, messy reality of the substance.
You really do. But stepping out of the shadow into the substance requires immense courage.
And because the stakes of retreating to the shadows are so cosmically high, the author deploys what is arguably the most terrifying rhetorical strategy in the New Testament.
Oh, the warning passages.
Yes. The Velocys survey categorizes this as the severe mercy.
These passages are visceral. I mean, texts like Hebrews 6.4-6 and 10.26-31.
They warn against deliberate apostasy, stating that if someone falls away after tasting the heavenly gift, it is impossible to restore them again to repentance.
Or that if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment.
And the theological weight of these warnings has generated centuries of intense debate.
I can imagine.
But the survey synthesizes this well. Evangelical interpreters have really fractured over how to read these texts. Arminian traditions argue that these passages prove a genuine believer can lose their salvation.
And Calvinist traditions.
They argue that the warnings apply to those who are intellectually illuminated but never truly regenerate, or that the loss described is a loss of heavenly reward rather than eternal salvation.
But if we zoom out from the systematic theology debates, we have to look at the immediate pastoral function of these words.
Yes, the author grounds these warnings in a very specific historical typology. The wilderness generation in chapters 3 and 4.
The Exodus narrative.
The wilderness typology is crucial here. The author reminds the community of their ancestors who were rescued from slavery in Egypt.
They experienced the plagues, they walked through the Red Sea, they ate the manna.
They had the promise of rest in the land of Canaan. Yet, that entire generation, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, perished in the desert.
Why?
Because of unbelief. When they reached the border of the promised land and saw the giants, they refused to trust God. They wanted to go back to Egypt.
They preferred the safety of slavery to the risk of the promise.
Exactly. The author maps this directly onto the first century audience. You have been delivered. You have tasted the heavenly gift. Do not repeat the wilderness rebellion.
Do not get to the very border of the new creation and turn back because the Roman Empire looks like a giant you can't defeat.
And the mechanism of this turning back is what I find so deeply unsettling.
The survey highlights the Greek term nuthros, right?
Yes. The author uses it in chapter 5 to describe their spiritual hearing.
What does it mean?
Nuthros means sluggish, dull, or lethargic. It paints a picture of someone who has just stopped caring.
So apostasy, in the worldview of Hebrews, isn't necessarily a sudden, violent rejection of faith.
No, it happens through sheer lethargy. You just drift.
Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it.
You stop rowing, the social current catches you, and before you know it, you are miles from the harbor.
The imagery of drifting is terrifying because it's passive. It requires zero effort to apostatize. You just have to stop enduring.
But how do we reconcile the sheer terror of these warnings with the deep assurances the author provides elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a huge tension. In chapter 6, the author talks about having a sure and steadfast anchor for the soul.
And in chapter 10, they talk about Christ perfecting for all time those who are being sanctified.
Right. If Christ's sacrifice is perfect and final, and the anchor is secure, Why threaten the community with the possibility of drifting into eternal judgment?
Doesn't the warning contradict the assurance?
That tension is the very heart of the letter's pastoral strategy. The author of Hebrews isn't resolving a philosophical puzzle about predestination.
They are waking up a sleeping community on the edge of a cliff.
The warnings are the functional mechanism of the assurance. They are severe mercies.
Think about it like if you are hiking a treacherous mountain pass.
Okay,
The guardrails and the warning signs aren't there to contradict your safety. They are the very means by which you arrive safely.
the warning jolts the Nuthros community out of their spiritual lethargy.
Faith, in Hebrews, is never defined as mere intellectual assent to historical facts. Faith is obedient endurance over time.
It is a massive wake-up call for a modern culture of drift.
It really is.
We rarely blow up our lives in a single dramatic moment of rebellion. Marriages don't usually end overnight. They dissolve through sluggishness, through 1,000 ignored conversations.
Careers stall out through subtle compromises. Spiritual lives wither through sheer neglect.
We just drift. The command to pay much closer attention is an urgent survival tactic for anyone navigating a current of apathy.
But the brilliance of the author is that they don't just scream at the audience to wake up and then leave them paralyzed with fear.
After the severe warnings, the sermon transitions into an empowering, highly practical masterclass on what endurance actually looks like.
And that brings the audience into the legendary Hall of Faith in chapter 11.
The transition into chapter 11 hinges on a massive, complex Greek word that defines the entire concept of endurance: hypostasis.
Hypostasis is a philosophically rich term. As we discussed earlier, in chapter 1, it was used to describe the exact imprint or substance of God's nature.
Right.
Here in chapter 11, verse 1, the author uses it to define faith itself. Now, faith is the hypostasis of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
Translators usually render it as assurance or substance. Faith is the substance of things hoped for.
Which means faith is not a psychological trick. It's not wishful thinking or closing your eyes and hoping a fantasy comes true.
Hypostasis implies an objective, underlying reality.
Faith is the present, assured realization of a future reality. It is allowing the unseen future to dictate your visible present.
And to prove that this kind of life is possible, the author curates a museum of Israel's history.
They walk the audience through the lives of the patriarchs and prophets, showing how every single one of them operated on the principle of hypostasis.
They focus a lot on Abraham, who packed up his entire life and left his homeland for a promised land he didn't know and never fully possessed.
The text explicitly says that Abraham lived in tents in the promised land as a stranger. He lived by promise, not by possession.
He was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God.
The survey also notes the radical inclusion of women in this patriarchal lineage.
Yes, Sarah is commended for her faith in receiving power to conceive when she was past the age of childbearing, because she considered him faithful who had promised.
And then there's Rahab.
Rahab is a fascinating inclusion. She was a Canaanite, a prostitute, and a foreigner living in Jericho.
Yet she is elevated in this Jewish Christian homily as a paragon of faith because she welcomed the Israelite spies,
She recognized the unseen reality of God's impending judgment and aligned herself with it.
risking her life in the visible world to secure her place in the unseen reality.
And Moses is perhaps the most direct parallel for the audience's current crisis.
The text says Moses chose to be mistreated with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin in Egypt.
He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking to the reward. The phrase, the reproach of Christ, applied to Moses is deeply profound. It collapses the redemptive timeline.
Moses' suffering in the ancient Egyptian court is participating in the same pattern of suffering that the first century audience is experiencing in the Roman Empire.
And the common denominator among all these figures is found in verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar.
If faith is hypostasis, the present substance of a future reality, it functions a bit like a navigational instrument.
How do you mean?
Well, if a captain is sailing a ship across a dark, violent ocean, using a telescope or a sextant to navigate by the stars doesn't physically bring those stars any closer.
Right, the captain can't touch them.
But the instrument provides the assured reality, the substance, that those stars are fixed and true.
Ah, I see.
Because the captain has absolute conviction in the unseen reality of those coordinates, they can steer the ship through the immediate darkness. The patriarchs were navigating their entire lives by stars they knew they wouldn't live to reach.
That is the exact dynamic the author is demanding of the readers.
And it flows seamlessly into the exhortation of chapter 12. The author shifts the imagery from a museum to a Roman stadium.
They tell the audience, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us.
Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith.
Jesus is the ultimate example of navigating by the unseen. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame.
He looked past the immediate horror of the crucifixion to the eschatological joy of redemption.
But chapter 12 also addresses the psychological toll of the audience's suffering.
Yeah, when you are constantly battered by society, the natural theological question is God angry with us? Is this punishment?
The author reframes their persecution through the lens of paternal discipline. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons.
They aren't being punished as criminals. They're being trained as athletes by a father who wants them to share his holiness.
This reframing is essential because it strips the Roman Empire of its ultimate power.
Rome isn't destroying them. God is using Rome's hostility to forge unbreakable endurance in his people.
And this endurance is anchored in the grand eschatological contrast at the end of chapter 12.
The author tells them they have not come to a terrifying, untouchable earthly mountain like Sinai, blazing with fire and gloom.
They have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem.
But I can imagine a skeptical reader in that first century house church throwing their hands up at this point.
Oh, absolutely. They are getting their businesses boycotted, their property confiscated, their leaders imprisoned.
How does telling them they have arrived at a heavenly Jerusalem practically help them pay for food?
Is this just a pious form of escapism? A way to say, don't worry about your stolen property, you'll get a mansion in the sky.
It is the exact opposite of escapism. The author brings all of this cosmic theology crashing down into the gritty ethical instructions of chapter 13.
The heavenly reality doesn't allow you to escape the earthly reality. It dictates how you behave within it.
Because their ultimate security is in an unshakable eternal city, they are totally free to live dangerously generous lives right now.
This is the eschatological tension of the already and the not yet. The theology directly informs the ethics.
Exactly. Look at the commands in chapter 13. Let brotherly love continue. Show hospitality to strangers. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them.
Keep your life free from the love of money.
You cannot obey those commands if your entire identity is tied up in your social status and your bank account.
If you love money,
Right.
you will apostatize the second the Romans threaten to confiscate your property.
But if your hypostasis is in the heavenly city, you can watch the authorities take your house and, as chapter 10 says, joyfully accept the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one.
The ultimate command in chapter 13 perfectly encapsulates the entire sermon.
The call to go outside the camp.
In the old cultic matrix, the earthly sanctuary in Jerusalem was a center of purity, power, and social prestige.
But Jesus was crucified outside the city gates, in the place of ultimate uncleanness and public shame.
The author is drawing a line in the sand. They are telling this exhausted, battered community, do not go back to the center of social respectability.
Go to Jesus outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. Embrace the shame. Let go of the need for the Roman Empire or the local synagogue to validate you.
And the anchor that allows a human being to endure that kind of terrifying marginalization is found in Hebrews 13:8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever.
The perfect, unshakable center.
So as we pull back and look at the entire scope of the Velasquez survey, we see that the letter to the Hebrews is a breathtaking piece of divine pedagogy.
It takes a community paralyzed by fatigue and social terror, and it systematically rebuilds their universe.
It proves that the fragmented shadows of the past have been eclipsed by the definitive substance of the Son.
Jesus is the final revelation, the indestructible high priest, the mediator of a better covenant.
Because he is the absolute reality. Retreating to the safety of the old shadows isn't just a strategic retreat, it is a fatal rejection of the truth.
It is a profound call to endurance, and it leaves us with a deeply provocative thought that builds on the persistent pilgrimage imagery woven throughout the entire document.
What's a thought?
Well, Hebrews tells us that believers are aliens and exiles, seeking a homeland. It tells us that we, right now, belong to an unshakable future city.
Right.
So the question for you, the listener, is, what does it mean to live as a true pilgrim in your own context?
If your ultimate citizenship is heavenly, how does that fundamentally disrupt the way you invest your time, protect your reputation, and utilize your resources in the earthly city you currently inhabit.
If you were navigating by the stars of that future city, you can't be anchored to the port of the present one. It changes the way you view everything.
A massive thank you to you, the listener, for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.
It is a demanding text, but the rewards of unpacking it are profound.
Keep questioning your assumptions, keep seeking the substance over the shadows, and keep pursuing knowledge. We will see you next time.